Hello, welcome back for another installment of all things Microsoft Dynamics GP. Let's get excited. Today we're talking about Receivables 101, and today we'll be looking at Microsoft Dynamics GP 2018, so the latest and greatest. Let's dive right in. Alright, so here we are within 2018, and we're going to cover the setup. We'll go through the cards, we'll go through the routines, utilities, reports, tools, really everything within GP. For receivables, we will not touch on sales order processing transactions because that is a much larger conversation that involves the inventory module, a little bit more going on, but we will touch on everything else. And we will touch on the new features of 2018 as well. So here we are, and here we go. So first things first, we'll spend a couple minutes here looking at some of the setup options within receivables. So voila, in the receivables setup window. First thing is you can set your custom aging periods. So if I wanted to show aging periods every single 10 days, I can set those in the system. By default, I believe it's going to give you current through 31 through 60. I guess really what you're seeing here. One thing to note is you can age in the system based on due date or based on document date. So what does that mean? So that means if my terms are net 30, if I send an invoice out today, tomorrow, I do not have any sort of outstanding aging. Nothing is showing as being past due or in the 31 to 60 day, or even in the 1 to 30 day bucket, because it's based on my due date. So my due date's 30 days from today. That means that anything between now and 30 days is in the current bucket. If I change my aging based on the document date, then tomorrow, all of a sudden I have a document that's been outstanding for 1 day. So that's the difference there. So by default, I think it's going to leave you a document date, and that's what I'm going to leave it with for now. All right, other significant options here. If we want to put a password on credit limits, so if I'm trying to process an invoice for a customer that's already at their credit limit, in order to actually post the invoice, I can make it password enabled. That's where I would set the password at here. Same thing goes with write-offs, waiving finance charges, taking a customer on and off hold. I can put a password in there as well. So for now, I'm going to leave the credit limit on there, maximum write-offs, and the ability to remove finance charges. Other options of significance here, if we want to age discounts or age credit memos, we can do that. So just keep in mind your aging reports, your trial balances, the ability to reprint statements. That's typically an option you want to enable. If you have it disabled, you can only print that particular statement for a customer at one time. We will go ahead and enable the option. This is a new feature with, I believe, 2018, maybe a version before, but there are queues that we can set up in the system so that when we are processing an invoice for a customer, if they are almost at their credit limit or about to exceed their credit limit, there will be a red dot that will show up in the system. Other items here. What do we want to assess if a customer sends us a check and it bounces? Insufficient funds charge, $15. You can set that up in the system. What's your default checkbook ID for cash receipts? That's what that is. Your price level. You can set different price levels in the system based on customers, if you're doing sales order processing, based on items. So your default price level, that's going to be what is everyone set at by default. You can override that price level with each customer. By default, this is what we're working with here. All right, and then we'll take a look into the options window here. If we want to change any of our document numbering, this is where we would do it. By default, it's set up pretty well. It gives you a lot of spaces here for filler documents. In some cases, way too many. The chances that any company in the world is going to hit, I don't know what that is, 10 trillion finance charge documents, probably slim to none. So if you really wanted to, you could reduce some of these filler zeros in there. Even if I get to this point where I get to, say, 10,000 documents for finance charges, it's just going to add a zero onto the end by default. So no harm in kind of shrinking these down if you'd like. If not, leave them as default and you'll be good to go. Other things to keep in mind here, if you'd like to include your history, as most people do, go ahead and select all those checkboxes. For user-defined fields, so when I'm setting up a customer, I could set up by default 2 separate user-defined fields. If I want the first user-defined to be customer type, I can add that field in there. But with the second user-defined to be, I don't know, how about region? You'll see when I'm setting up a customer, I will now have the field in there that says region, and then I can tag a region to that customer. Same concept with customer addresses. We won't toggle anything there. And then the rest of the information here is just kind of for your information. And then the tax schedule details. If we want to set up taxes to automatically apply in the system, this is where it starts. So you would want to set up your tax schedule IDs at the company setup window first. All right, so we'll move on from the receivable setup. Other things that we might consider setting up now is the classes. Classes are really used for reporting and used to speed up the process of adding a new customer to the system. First class I have here is Australian. This is my Australian customer. So anytime I'm adding a new Australian customer, say I want their default AR account to go to a specific account, or I want their cash receipts to default to a specific checkbook. This is where I've set those types of options so that way when I'm setting up a customer, this is, look, this is 40 different things that I don't have to input at the time that I set up that customer. I just choose a class, all these options roll down, and therefore the first time when I'm using that customer, by default, it's going to debit the accounts receivable account 1200 in the process. So that's kind of the whole concept behind classes, and that is for reporting and for speeding up the process of adding a new customer. Outside of that, mostly what else you're seeing here pertains to sales order processing, so we're not going to go into that today. So we'll stop talking about the receivable setup window, and let's go right into the cards. So just like the other modules, purchasing, financial, fixed assets, etc., inventory, the cards is where you're going to set up your master record information. So of course, this is where I'm setting up my customers, this is where I'm setting up my addresses, salespeople, that type of information is all stored under cards. So let's go into a customer. So we're in the customer maintenance window, and I'm not going to go through the process of setting up a new customer from scratch. We'll just go ahead and select an existing customer, and we'll kind of talk it through here. So one of the most important things is, again, let's use that class reporting. It'll also speed up the process. So when we set up this customer originally, this USA class here, it defaulted half the information that you're seeing in front of you. So that's half the time that it's going to take me to actually set up a customer from scratch. So you notice over here we have a statement name versus a regular name. The statement name, obviously it's going to go in the statement. If you want that to vary from the rest of the names that you see in the system, that's where you can define that. Another thing to note down here in the bottom left is there are different address ID capabilities. So say I have a customer who has a central location that is their headquarters, and they have multiple ship-to locations. I could actually set up each one of those ship-to locations for this customer in the system, so that way when I'm processing invoices, if I'm actually sending products to those customers, I can select that ship-to at the time that I'm setting up the invoice. Same thing with bill to. Say I have one central entity and they have multiple billing departments based on the actual division that you're working with that customer. You can set those up in the system as well, so that way when we're processing invoices, it actually goes to a different set of bill to information. Salesperson, territory, all information that we can attach, and we can actually go through a process later to generate commissions for salespeople. And we talked about it earlier, we set up the user defined fields, so we have the customer type, and if we wanted to put in a region for this customer, we could do that here as well. Shipping method, this is important for for sales tax purposes. If I have a shipping method option set to pick up, when I process a invoice to this customer, it's going to set it to basically say that this customer came to my facility and picked up their product. Therefore, when I'm assessing sales tax, it's going to base the sales tax percentage based on the location of my facility. If I have their shipping method set to delivery, it's going to use a combination of the sales tax rate, the ship to address, and the shipping method to say that calculate sales tax based on the delivered to address. An important note there, tax schedule ID. We won't go into a ton of tax information today. It's kind of a larger conversation, but do know that you can set a default tax schedule ID for each customer. And if I look at this tax schedule ID, I see that it's set with these two tax details. So the tax detail here is actually Illinois State and Chicago being the city. All right, other things to note here, you do have your customer payment terms. If you wanted to put in a specific price level for this customer, we get to find that here. Let's go into the accounts. So no surprise here, these are my default distributions. Checkbook ID, this is going to be the default checkbook ID that will come into play if you're ever processing an invoice and you're saying that you received cash at the time that you're processing the invoice or ahead of the time that you're processing invoices. This would be the default checkbook ID that would default in for this customer. Looking at options here, you have a couple different options that are kind of important. The finance charge percentage, you can set kind of the maximum percentage for this customer that when you run through the finance charge process, it is going to assess 1.5% of their outstanding balance to their account. The credit limit, obviously that's important. And same thing with maximum write-off. Without setting a maximum in here, if I were to, I think by default it says to not allowed. If I do not put in either unlimited or maximum, it's not going to let me write off balances to their account whatsoever. So important notes here. And if you're working to set up customers for credit card payments in the system, which we will not go into today, again, a much larger conversation above the 101 level, we'll say. This is where you would put in that information there as well. Last thing I want to touch on here with the customer setup is the email setup window. And this just basically enables this customer to receive Word template documents in the system. So if you're familiar with the reports in GP and the templates that you can put on top of reports, basically for this customer, at the time that I select receivables invoice, I am telling the system that this customer can receive the Word template for receivables invoices should I have the Word template set up. When this customer receives a Word template, the default email message ID that they're going to receive is this sales document one, which I have also set up in the system. Without these options selected, I cannot email this customer documents out of the system, and they will not receive the better looking Word templates. They will receive the out of the box report writer reports. All right, so that's the basics of a customer setup. Go ahead and discard those. Another thing I want to touch on here is national accounts. If I ever have a customer that I have multiple customers in the system that kind of represent one customer, I can set up the parent-child relationship here within national accounts. So I could select my parent customer. We'll say that's Aaron Fitz, and then Aaron Fitz children would be Adam Park and Advanced Paper Cow. So what this actually gives me the ability to do is it lets me report for receivables trial balance purposes. I can say that, okay, as a whole, Aaron Fitz owes me everything that we have attached to Aaron Fitz account, as well as everything to Adam Park and Advanced Paper Cow. Also, when I'm processing cash receipts, I have the ability to select Aaron Fitz as my customer and then apply it to the invoices that are attached to these customers beneath them. So that's kind of the gist of the national accounts. There's definitely more information out there that shows you a little bit, goes into a little bit more detail of what you actually have to do to make that work. So we'll close out of there. We'll come back to the summary window. It makes probably more sense for the summary window to be under inquiry, so we will come back to it. Customer vendor, if you ever get in a situation where you want to link customers and vendors for, say, refund check purposes, this is where you would start. Again, that's a much larger conversation. We've actually posted another video on the customer vendor consolidation process as well as the refund check process, so definitely check it out. And you would also set up your salespeople here under cards, and if you're setting up a lockbox, which I'm sounding like a broken record here, but lockbox setup is a little more advanced and not something we'll cover today. But the gist of a lockbox is that I can download a file from my lockbox bank, and I can upload that file into my system and basically record a bunch of cash receipts all at one time. So very nifty. If you're doing high volume, I would highly recommend looking into lockbox processing. All right, so we've covered the setup, we've covered the cards, which being the customers, which you'll need in order to do the next step, which is let's go ahead and process some invoices. So under the transactions window, I'm going to go directly into transaction entry. And I guess before I start talking about this, the top section here is all the sales order processing windows. And we are going to skip over those for now. So I'm in the receivables transaction entry window. And first thing you'll notice here is I have my type. 9 times out of 10, you're going with either a sales invoice or a debit memo, credit memo. I don't think I have to explain those concepts. So we're going to leave it with a sales invoice here. We'll do invoice for services. The batch concept, if I am processing high volume, I'm about to process a lot of invoices at once, I might go ahead and create my batch. Kyle, AR, let's go with 071518. You want to add this batch? Yes. If I want to add comments to this batch, sure. This is my daily sales invoice processing. My GL posting date. So I'm about to process a ton of invoices at once. If I want all of them to post on this month or on this day, I would go ahead and leave my posting date in as it is. And my checkbook ID, I'm processing invoices, so it's not really going to come into play, but I kind of talked about it earlier. If I'm processing an invoice and at the same time I'm about to book cash that I received, this is where the checkbook ID in this window comes into play. All right, so I'm going to hit enter to get out of the batch window. Click back through. Document date, that is the invoice date. That is the date that we're basing our aging off of. So pretty important. Customer ID. Mentioned earlier, if this customer has multiple addresses, this is where I can select those different addresses at this time. So this other information that you're seeing here, it's all defaulting from the customer setup. If the customer had a PO number, I can input that here. And then we'll go down to the fields below. If there were a cost to this sale, I could input this information here, and it's going to create some sort of cost adjustment in the distributions. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and say this is straight up a $5,000 invoice. We'll give them a $10 discount for being one of our favorite customers. That's where the trade discount could come into play. If we wanted to tack on freight charges separately, we could do that here as well. Say $45 for freight. Miscellaneous, we'll leave that blank. And then sales tax. So sales tax, I mentioned this earlier a little bit, but the sales tax actually calculates from the location of this customer's address, because the shipping method I have selected here says local delivery, and the delivery option is selected. So it says I'm delivering to this customer address, therefore assess the taxes based on this customer address. Had the shipping method said pickup, it would have assessed sales tax based on my company address setup. So important note there, and we'll move on. If at the time that I'm booking this invoice, I've already received cash, or it's a point of sale transaction, they're handing me cash, I can actually go in and denote that information here. That's where I would pick my checkbook. This is where it defaults from the patch, but that's where this comes into play. But for this transaction, I'm going to say it's a straight up receivables invoice, and we have not received cash yet. So let's go in and take a look at distributions. All of my distributions are populating either from my customer setup, and had my customer been missing any of these defaults, it would then be picking up from my company setup. So under administration, under posting, there's a posting account section that you can define company-wide default accounts. So pulls from the customer. If not the customer, pulls from the company setup. Okay, so nothing to change here. I'm going to leave it as is. And I could go ahead, and since I have a batch built, I can save this transaction into my batch. I happen to be overriding my credit limit, which is a good prompt there, but I have a lot of power here. I know the passwords, so I'm going to move on. If I had more transactions to process, again, I created this batch. I could add these transactions in here, save, basically build my batch, and then when I'm ready to post, the process to post is to click this blue arrow to open up the batch window. You want to close the transaction window, and then I want to post up here. If I open up the batch window and then I just go in here and hit post, it's going to tell me that I'm currently processing transactions in this batch. So that's why I close the transaction window behind it. So my batch here, I have one transaction for $5,300, and the posting date is the date that it's going to hit the GL is 4/12/2017. If I knew ahead of time that I'm about to process a batch of transactions and it's going to be 10 transactions, I could have put in my control number here, and that would have prevented me from posting until my actual number of transactions match my control number. Same thing with the batch total. If I know that I'm about to process $100,000 in invoices, it will not let me post this batch until I actually have $100,000 worth of invoices in the batch. So for now, I'm going to leave the batch control at 0, hit post. We'll go ahead and take a look at some of these reports here. I don't care about the distribution detail. I don't care about the checkbook. So here's my receivables posting journal. It's really just my header information for my sales invoice, as well as all of my distributions that are going to impact my general ledger. And then scrolling down a little bit further, it's also giving me information on the sales tax that I've captured here, and the salesperson that was included on this invoice, as well as the sales territory. So the receivables posting journal, pretty good report. If you're going to print something from the system, this would be the report to print here. You have the ability to go back in and pull all of these reports after the fact. So I'm not a huge proponent of printing these as you go, but should you insist, here you are. I'm going to close my report. And so there we are. We have processed a sales invoice to our customer. We have money that's in our receivables, and we're expecting to get paid. So the magic day comes and our customer actually pays up. What do we want to do? We want to go in, we want to book a cash receipt. So I'm going to stay in transactions under cash receipts. I open up my cash receipts window. I'll go ahead and first thing that's going to be required is, let's definitely put in the customer here. We'll select Aaron Fitz. The type of payment that I just received, I will go ahead and I'm going to select cash. If I wanted to recognize it as being a check, and therefore I have to clear it once the check actually clears, I can actually put in the check number. I can put that. I can leave it at the check option, but for now I'm just going to leave it at cash. And I'm going to say I just received $1,000 from Aaron Fitz. The checkbook that I'm actually depositing the cash into is my Uptown Trust account. And then let's go into the apply window. So Aaron Fitz is obviously paying me for something. Let's go ahead and say that he paid me for this invoice. He paid me for this invoice. And you'll see that out of the $1,000 that I originally had unapplied, I am down to 0. So I have fully applied this invoice. So what else can we do in this window? Notice here there is a write-off section. There's an apply amount, realized gain loss. You'll notice that I applied $938 to the first invoice. I applied $61 to the second invoice. If I wanted to go ahead and write off some of these invoices, I can actually do that process right from here. So with this customer, we have a maximum write-off limit of $25. So if I input a write-off amount for, say, $10, it'll let me go ahead and write off some part of that invoice right this second. So it doesn't really make sense in this example that I just used, but let's say that the customer paid me for this invoice down here at the bottom, and the customer gave us a $2,340. So I would recognize $2,340 against this $2,356. And then my write-off amount would be the remainder, which I would say it's immaterial. So I'll write off the $16 or so at that time. Therefore, my cash receipt's fully applied, my invoice is fully applied, and there's nothing left to do with that customer. All right, so I have fully applied this invoice. I'm saying that the day that I applied the cash to the invoice was this apply date up here. Why that matters is for aging purposes. If my apply date were to be 05/01/2027, if I run an aging as of 04/30/2027, the invoice is still going to be outstanding. So I want to make sure that my apply date is correct. So therefore my aging reports, my trial balances will check out as well. All right, so I've applied it. And last thing I would do here, since I do not have a batch built, I can just go right up here and click the post button. Had I had a batch built, I would have clicked the blue button, opened up the batch window, closed the transaction window, and then posted the batch. So let's go ahead and post. And it leaves a window open so that I could continue processing cash receipts, but I'm done. So I'm gonna go ahead and close, and then I'll get prompted to print some of these reports. So like the last time we printed the posting journal, I'm gonna go ahead and print the posting journal here again. And again, this is probably the most pertinent information that you care about regarding cash receipts. So what was my amount? What were my distributions? There's my write-off. What did I apply to? All included on this one report. So there we are. We process invoices. We've applied cash receipts to them. Let's kind of just trickle through this list here. Also underneath transactions is the apply sales documents. So if I have a customer that I've ran an aging for and I see that there's an outstanding credit memo and there's an outstanding invoice, I can actually open up this customer. I could say, show me the list of credit memos. And then I could pick that outstanding, in this case, to switch back to a return. I could pick this outstanding return document and say, okay, yeah, let's go ahead and let's apply it to a few of these sales invoices. So the apply sales document window, that could be part of your month-end process to clean up some of your outstanding receivables. Moving on, the refund checks process, I mentioned it briefly earlier, but if I ever am in the situation where I have a customer and I need to send money back to that customer, I can go through the refund check process to send the money out on really the payable side. Lockbox entry, again, a little higher than 101, but that is a feature in here. The series post. So let's pretend that I am an accounting manager and I have all of the security to post. The clerks do not have the ability to post. So what they all do is they're building their batches, they're getting their approvals, and once they're done, they're just saving their batches. So I actually want to come into series post and I can view all of the outstanding batches at one time. I can select said batches, and then I, as the accounting manager, can post them all at once. So that's where series post comes in handy. Edit transaction information. This is a new feature. If I have invoices that are posted already, but I need to change just something simple. So say I need to change the due date, or I need to change what the description of that invoice was because it printed on the customer invoice and it was incorrect. I can use this edit receivables transaction information window and I can change a few of these fields. PO number, that's another one. Anything else that you do not see in this window, so say the invoice amount, I can't change that. That would be a huge audit concern. So just keep that in mind. There are some fields you can change once it's posted, but the majority of the fields are kind of set in stone. That's a good thing, I promise you. Receivables batches, this window we kind of looked at earlier, but if I want to do select here, I can take a look at all my outstanding batches and I can post here as well. All right, so that does it for transactions. Let's go ahead and we'll take a look at inquiry. You're going to use the inquiry windows whenever you want to look at one particular item. So if I want to look at one particular customer, I go to transaction by customer, and I can take a look at all their transactions at once. If I ever want to look at, say, all customers and all invoices at once, I would use a report in the system or a SmartList. But again, if I'm just looking for one particular transaction, inquiry is the way to go. So on this, on the customer inquiry window here, you notice there's some options here. If I want to only include unposted invoices, that's what the work status is. I can deselect those checkboxes and I can see that, okay, in those unposted batches, I have 3 transactions out here for Aaron Fitz. I can select the transaction, click the document number to drill back, and then I could actually open up this transaction in the transaction window and make changes to it before I posted it, or delete it, post it, whatever. So other options here, if I want to filter based on the invoice date, I could put in that filter here as well. After you put in the filters, you want to select the redisplay option up here, and then the sort by. This is new with 2018, but I can sort my documents based on additional criteria as well. So if I always want to say sort based on the amount remaining, that's what I'm doing here. All right, so other inquiry windows, if I want to go transaction by document, to say I have one particular invoice in mind, I want to go ahead and just type in that one particular invoice, hit redisplay. I can pull up just that invoice. So good window. Other information here is the summary windows. So if I want really a snapshot of this customer, a summary window is most likely where I'm going to go. So this particular summary window, I selected the period summary. This lets me pick one particular period, and then I can see the number of invoices that were applied to this vendor, cash that came in the door, etc. So there's these summary windows that you see here, and then we also, I skimmed over it earlier, but there's also another summary window under the cards section as well. There's a credit summary tab. I can take a look at the average days of pay for this customer. If some of this information, if there had been if there had been cash receipts in this section, I would have a last check date, that type of information. But just know that there are multiple ways to view summary snapshots for customers or invoices in the system. Scrolling down a little bit further, I have the ability to look at a particular salesperson. And if I ever just want to open up a customer, if I don't want to make changes to a customer, I just want to open them up and view their information, you want to go with an inquiry window instead of going with a card window. See the difference here? So if I'm directing someone to get into the system, they just want to look at customers, but I don't want them to have the ability to change those customers, I would direct them to the customer inquiry window. One thing with both the customer maintenance and the customer inquiry window is there's the ability to select print, and I can actually, once I've run the statement process, which we'll talk about next, I can actually print my statement directly from the customer windows, and that's a new feature with 2018. So we'll move on. So that's it for cards, that's it for transactions, that's it for inquiry. Let's take a look at some of the routines. So aging. Do note that the aging process is not automatic. I can't really give you a good reason why as to why it's a separate process, but it is what it is. In order to age, to actually take the balances from either your current period to your 1 to 30 period, or 1 to 30 to 31 to 60, that calculation happens at the time that you run this aging process within the routine section. So my aging date, I would leave it at the current date, system date, and I would just go ahead and select process. Now that I've run my aging, if I were to open up a customer and say the receivable summary snapshot, now these buckets would be up to date. All right, also under routines, after I've run my aging, if I want to subsequently go in and assess finance charges, that's where I would do this process. So keep in mind the finance charge process, it looks at the customer setup. It says, well, how much am I going to assess to this customer? If you recall earlier, I believe the first customer we were looking at had a 1.5% finance charge. So that would say anything that's overdue for that customer, assess 1.5% to their balance. And that actually creates a whole transaction and applies it to their account automatically when I go through this assess finance charge process. the statements process. So I've run aging, I've assessed my finance charges. I can now go into my statements process window and I can generate a whole slew of statements at the same time. So to do that, I would go through the options of setting it up. What form do I want to use? What company address is it going to show it's all coming from? Do I want to show credit limits on the statements? Do I want to show finance charges, payment terms, that type of information? Setting up statements, it'll take some tweaking on your own. There are additional resources out there on finding more about the customer statement process. It's a little more involved than what we'll cover today. So that's it. So I'll close out of there. So the write-off document process, kind of like the finance charge process, there are settings at the customer that say how much this write-off process is actually going to do. So if I have a customer with a $4 receivable balance and I've set their maximum write-off on their account to be $5, when I run this process, it's automatically going to write off that $4 for that customer. So what it actually does is, again, just like the finance charge process, it actually creates a transaction called a write-off and reduces that customer's balance. The last big note here is the paid transaction removal tool. If you're familiar with the document statuses in GP, in the receivables module, you have work, open, and history. When I fully apply an invoice, it stays in the open status until I run this paid transaction removal tool. So without going into a ton of detail, you probably want to get into the habit of running this paid transaction removal tool on a quarterly, semi-annual, annual basis. All it does, it doesn't actually remove anything, very big note. It takes the documents from the open status that are fully applied and it moves them to the history status. So what that means is that's going to be fewer transactions that you're seeing in the system. So like the apply sales document window, you're going to see fewer transactions there. It's not going to show all those transactions that are applied but not moved to history. And really, the intention is that it speeds up the system when you run the paid transaction removal, because you're seeing fewer transactions in each one of those windows that are loading. So that's a paid transaction removal. And then I should have mentioned this toward the beginning, but with any window that you're in GP, I can always just select F1 and it's going to open up the help window that's provided by Microsoft. So I'm in the paid transaction removal window, and right here it kind of gives me information on what this window actually does. If I click on the fields, it actually breaks down field by field what the fields actually do. So across the board, always use this F1 option if you're ever in here and you're not sure exactly what some of these fields do. So moving on, let's take a look at some of our reports. So one of the big ones is show me a trial balance. There's one very important note when it comes to trial balances. An aged trial balance is right this second. A historical aged trial balance says, what did it look like as of 5 days ago or at the end of the month? So depending on what you're trying to accomplish, it depends on which report you want to run here. If someone just comes up to my desk and said, hey Kyle, how much money are we owed from all of our customers? I'm going to generate an aged trial balance. If it's at the end of the month and I want to say, okay, for my month-end package, let's go ahead and show what the receivables were as of 7/31, I would generate the historical aged trial balance. So let's take a look at this aged trial balance with options. Just for the record, the with options gives you options. It gives you a little more, obviously a little more options than you get with the out-of-the-box aged trial balance. So aged trial balance with options. I'm just going to select an existing report and select modify. And I'll see here that I have the ability to exclude credit balances if I want to. If I want to exclude fully applied documents, I would do that there. Obviously, I do want to do that. I do not want to exclude credit balances because that is part of my AR. For my date, well, again, I'm running a aged trial balance as of this moment. So there is no way to put a date filter on the system. So beneath here, I have a couple different options on what the report is actually going to generate for. So if I want to filter it on a specific class, I can build that report. If I want to based it on a certain state of the customer, zip code, that type of information. I can insert those filters here. So for whatever reason, I want to go based on the customer names. When I generate this report, it's now just going to include customers between this and this. So I'll go ahead and I'll select OK here. I set my destination option. I just want to print this to the screen. I don't want to send it directly to the printer. And I'm going to go ahead and select print. And here is my current aging report for those customers that were in my filter. All right, so outside of aging, what else is important? Well, let's talk about maybe someone comes up and they say, okay, show me all of our invoices for a particular customer over the past 12 months. So under reports, history, I can select a receivables transaction history report, and that would be a good place for me to get that type of information. Posting journals, I mentioned earlier, you can print to your heart's desire, but for most of the reports in the system, you can always go back in and pull them at a later date. So if I'm trying to provide support to my auditors for a journal entry that's sitting out there, the journal entry originated in the sales module, I can actually go to the report section, posting journals, and print a particular set of transactions from 6 months ago. Commissions reporting. So with each transaction that we were processing today, there was a customer ID, or there was a salesperson that was attached to that invoice. So I can actually go in here and generate a report that shows how much commission is actually owed to my salespeople. All right, other reporting options. If you are not familiar, you will want to get familiar, but under SmartList, everything that we've done today is going to be found within the sales section. The sales line item and sales transaction, that is sales order processing transactions, so we will not be looking in there. But the receivables transactions, that's probably where I want to start if I'm looking for a big report listing of all of my transactions in the system. Customers, I need a quick list of my customers. If I want to export it to Excel, I can do all that. All right, and then last but not least, I do want to touch on the utilities here, just so you know that they are available. Use at your own risk. If you ever have to remove a list of transactions from the system, so say we have 20 years of activity in GP and we just want to go ahead and get rid of 10 years, under utilities, I can actually run the process to remove transaction history. That's where I would do that. Every now and then the system can become out of whack. So let's say I'm looking at an aging report and my buckets just aren't tying out. The utility under here, reconcile, I can reconcile my current customer information or my outstanding documents amounts, and that can kind of clean up the system, if you will. So just keep that in mind. If I'm ever looking at this and my numbers just don't seem to be tying out, start with reconcile and see if that fixes your problem. So that's it, everyone. That is Receivables 101 within Dynamics GP and within Dynamics GP 2018. I hope you got what you're looking for today, but if not, please post in the comments. Let me know. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Check out the website. We do a lot of blogging as well as these YouTube videos, and we cover a lot of receivables topics, so there might be something there that you might be looking for. But really, stay engaged, if you will. Please subscribe. I'd love to hear from you. Love to hear what else you're looking for. So let me know. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.